The prairie boiled that morning. The air, thick with dust, clung to every breath as the sun beat down on the cracked earth. The incessant buzz of insects was drowned out by the shuffle of worn-out shoes on dry soil. A trio of Chinese women, identical triplets with torn and stained clothing, stumbled out of the shimmering heat haze. They had run out of water 2 days ago and food the day before that. When they saw the rancher on horseback, rifle resting across his saddle, they stopped as if the earth itself had seized them. A single, barked command cut through the oppressive heat. "Get them off!" Bend down, one of the sisters, Mai, who had a fragile grasp of English, froze, uncertain. Her sisters, Lian and Fen, stood motionless, their eyes wide and fingers trembling, dust streaked across their faces. It wasn't just fear. It was the humiliation they had been warned to expect in this foreign land. In their minds, being captured by these rough men meant a disgrace worse than death. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. The rancher's tone hardened. He repeated the order, slower this time, colder. Mai finally stammered a translation, her voice shaking. None of the women understood why they were being ordered to strip or why the rancher and his hands kept scanning their bodies. In the stories they'd been told, capture meant torture. In reality, this was a crude search protocol, routine for a man wary of drifters and thieves. But that nuance was lost between languages and shimmering heat. Lian whispered to her sister in their native tongue, "They will kill us now." Instead, an older ranch hand stepped forward. He checked their sleeves, belts, and the worn soles of their shoes for hidden weapons or stolen goods. It was standard procedure for the rancher, Boone, after having been robbed by desperate travelers weeks earlier. From the prisoner's perspective, this was unthinkable. Being ordered to undress by the enemy wasn't just exposure, it was the shattering of their entire code of honor. Yet in that suspended moment, something shifted. The men didn't jeer or strike. They just inspected, nodded, and moved aside. The women realized this wasn't humiliation before execution. It was confusion, caution, a procedure they couldn't comprehend. One of them later wrote in a hidden journal, "We thought this was humiliation before death, but no one died that day." The only thing that broke was certainty, the certainty of what they'd been told about their enemies. As the rancher's boots crunched closer through the dust, a new kind of fear took shape, not of dying, but of being misunderstood. The rancher, Boone, stepped forward again, frustration clear on his face. He repeated the command, his tone rough. Mai's patchwork English was enough for simple orders, not for nuance. The word she chose turned inspection into strip. That single mistranslation froze the moment. The women, terrified, believed the rumors they'd heard since they arrived in this country, stories that captured women were defiled before being left for dead. Fen clutched a small, sharpened stone hidden in her sleeve, ready to take her own life if needed. Boone noticed her movement and barked another word, but the wind snatched it away. For a heartbeat, the two sides stared across the dusty ground, each thinking the other was seconds from violence. Then the older ranch hand stepped forward again, hands raised, speaking softly. He mined a search, tapping his own sleeves and showing his empty palms. Slowly, the message landed. The Chinese women began to comply, stiffly removing their outer layers. Their eyes darted toward Mai for cues that never came. The ranchers weren't brutes, they were scared. Desperate drifters had attacked homesteads in the area recently. Every gesture felt like a potential trap. One of the sisters later whispered, "They weren't monsters, just terrified of us." When the inspection ended, the women were handed coarse blankets and motioned to sit in the shade of a large rock. The men stepped back, uncertain how to act around prisoners who looked more like exhausted, frightened girls than dangerous vagrants. The rancher removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and muttered something under his breath. Mai didn't translate it, but one word stood out, protocol. For the first time, the tension broke not with violence, but with an awkward silence heavy enough to smother the prairie heat. The sisters, still shivering despite the temperature, realized that death had passed them by. In its place, another feeling crept in, curiosity. Because what came next wasn't cruelty at all. It was care. Night fell like a curtain over the vast, empty prairie. The heat eased into a cool breeze, and the only light came from a flickering campfire near the ranch house. The Chinese sisters sat under a makeshift lean-to, shivering, their arms wrapped in the rough blankets. Every crunch of boots, every distant coyote howl made them flinch. They expected mockery, punishment, or worse. But instead, someone approached, holding something that glowed faintly in the firelight. A tin can. "Beans," the man said, kneeling. He slid it across the dirt, then stepped back. The women didn't move. Lian finally opened it with trembling fingers, the savory scent rising like something unreal, canned food in the middle of nowhere. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. That night, the captives watched the ranchers eat from identical rations. No special treatment, no laughter at their expense, just quiet chewing and the occasional cough. Then, astonishingly, one of the men handed them spoons. It was the smallest act, yet it broke years of fearful propaganda in an instant. For women who had survived on foraged roots and scraps, this was an abundance beyond imagination. One sister wrote later, "Even their prisoners ate better than we had in months." As the hours passed, they realized something even stranger. No one hit them. No one yelled. Instead, the older ranch hand came by with a jar of salve and clean rags. He motioned for their hands. Hesitant, Fen offered hers, bloodied and blistered. The man dabbed the salve on her wounds and said nothing. The sting burned, but the gesture disarmed her more than any weapon could. Across the camp, another ranch hand joked quietly with his partner. And for the first time since their capture, the women heard something they hadn't expected from these rough men, laughter that wasn't cruel. It was ordinary, human. Later, as they lay under the damp blankets, they listened to the faint creak of the windmill somewhere in the dark. For them, survival had been a desperate, daily struggle. For these men, it was routine. In that contrast, something fundamental cracked. The enemy wasn't barbaric. They were organized, fed, and frighteningly efficient. The firelight flickered against the sisters' faces, reflecting both fear and wonder. Outside, boots crunched toward their shelter again, this time not with rifles, but with more bandages and a single metal kettle steaming in the night. By dawn, the prairie smelled of dust and dew. The ranchers had moved quickly. A small, isolated barn, previously used for storage, had been cleared out. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and disinfectant. The Chinese women were led inside, not as prisoners this time, but as something else they didn't have a word for. The transformation was almost surreal. Where they expected chains, they found clean straw beds. Where they feared ropes, they saw soap. The ranch hands worked in silence, their eyes focused. They weren't gentle, but they were methodical. One pointed at a metal basin. "Wash," he grunted. Mai's voice trembled through the translation, but the meaning was clear enough. One by one, the women scrubbed. The water turned gray, then brown, then black. It wasn't just dirt coming off, it was months of hardship. Boone's wife, a stern-faced woman named Martha, entered next, her expression professional. She started examining their wounds, noting their condition with a clinical eye. Malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion. Disease was deadlier than a bullet out here, and they treated even these strangers because an illness didn't care about race. Lian, feverish and weak, whispered something Mai barely caught. "Why help us?" Martha, hearing the translated question, shrugged. Rules of the house. The irony stung deeper than the antiseptic. The same code that saw them as a threat now demanded their care. When the women emerged from the barn, they looked less like fugitives and more like ghosts, freshly cleaned for a new afterlife. The ranch smelled of coffee and horses. The vast prairie beyond smelled like everything they'd left behind, fear and desperation. They noticed something else, too. The ranchers' clothes were patched and dusty, but intact. Their boots didn't fall apart. Their supplies didn't vanish. This was an empire of logistics, not slogans. In the middle of it, the women realized that power wasn't always cruelty. It could also be competence. As the sun climbed higher, one of the sisters caught the distant sound of laughter from the main house, a strange, musical sound. She leaned toward the door to listen, not realizing that what happened next would mark a turning point in their strange captivity. The laughter outside faded. Boone sat at a rough-hewn table, a dim lantern casting long shadows across the room. His gloves lay beside him, mud-streaked and torn at the fingertips. In front of him was a ledger, its pages already mottled with sweat and ink. He wrote like a man trying to reason with himself. They look more like students than vagrants, one entry began. I sunken, hands raw. Couldn't be older than 20-inch. The men around him played cards and swapped stories. Boone didn't join. His duty had been to secure his property, but what lingered with him wasn't the threat, it was their faces. He'd seen desperate men, but never enemies so fragile. Somewhere deep inside, a line he didn't know existed had started to blur. His words showed a man wrestling with suspicion and empathy in the same breath. He described the silence of the barn after dark, the women whispering in their own language, the guards pretending not to hear. Rules are rules, he wrote again, but the sentence trailed off mid-line, as if he'd stopped believing it halfway through. At one point, he recorded an exchange. Why are they so quiet? One of the hands had asked. Maybe they think we're going to kill them tomorrow, Boone replied. Are we? No. Not unless someone gives me a reason to. That was life out here in a sentence. Nobody knew the rules anymore, only that they had to keep pretending they did. Near the end of his entry that night, Boone closed with a line that felt like a confession. We were told to be wary, but no one told us how to be human. He shut the ledger, slid it into a drawer, and stared toward the barn where the women now slept. In the faint glow of dawn, the first signs of a new routine began. He didn't know it yet, but this strange, unspoken arrangement would become the longest season of their lives. The whistle of the morning train, miles away but carried on the wind, became their new clock. The prairie mist clung low as the sisters began their new life. Still weak, they carried what little they had, blankets, scraps of dignity, and a shared, unspoken fear. The routine was ranch life, turned inside out. Every morning, the same pattern unfolded: wake, a meager breakfast, mending clothes or tending a small garden, then rest. For women trained in a world of strict traditions, captivity became its own strange discipline. They scrubbed their own floors, folded their own blankets, and learned the rhythm of their captors' footsteps. Slowly, something began to shift. The fear dulled into routine, routine into survival. Boone watched from a distance, ledger again in hand. He noticed details the others missed, the way they bowed slightly before eating, how they murmured thanks in their own language even when no one understood. One morning, he saw Mai trying to read the brand on a cattle prod, King Ranch. She traced each letter with her finger, whispering the sounds. When he asked what she was doing, she looked up and said softly, learning your words. That moment, tiny and awkward, stuck with him more than any fight he'd been in. The ranchers, too, seemed to relax. They stopped staring like guards and started acting like neighbors forced to share the same sunburnt reality. They traded a bit of sugar for intricate stitching that repaired their torn clothes, a bar of soap for help in the garden. The women even began mending the ranchers' shirts, a reversal that unsettled everyone at first, then became normal. Still, every passing rider on the horizon reminded them this was not freedom. One sister later wrote, "We became nameless, but clean as night fell, the lamps were lit, bathing the ranch in a faint yellow light." And beneath that hum, one voice broke the silence, reading quietly from a book of folk tales she'd found, a story she'd never be able to share. Late nights in the barn carried a sound different from the prairie wind, the slow, careful rustle of a pencil scratching across salvaged scraps of paper. The sisters wrote when the ranch went quiet, when the only light came from the flicker of a single kerosene lamp. They wrote to families they weren't sure were alive, to a life that seemed a world away. They didn't have envelopes, just folded sheets tucked under their thin mattresses. Some drew small flowers in the margins, others apologized for still breathing. The act of writing was rebellion in its softest form. Boone noticed it one night while making his rounds. Fen was crouched by the lamplight, her lips moving silently as she wrote. He didn't stop her. He just nodded and walked past. He knew those letters would never leave the ranch. They wrote anyway, as if words could cross deserts and mountains without permission. One letter, found decades later, read simply, "I am alive," but smaller. That was enough. By the turn of the season, the prisoners no longer asked when they'd be released. They just wrote. The words became anchors, a ritual. When you can't speak to the world, you build one instead. At sunrise one morning, an unfamiliar wagon rattled up the path, its driver bringing supplies and news. His boots left dark prints across the dusty yard. The writing stopped mid-sentence as everyone looked up. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to fit on a scrap of paper. The day started like any other: chores, the midday meal, the oppressive heat. But by mid-morning, the air changed. The ranchers gathered near the main house, their faces unreadable. The supply wagon driver was talking animatedly, gesturing down the road. A faint excitement bled through the usual quiet of the ranch. The driver's voice was loud and carried on the wind. Mai listened first, her eyes widening, then she whispered the impossible: a railroad. The women froze. News had traveled by wagon that the railroad was pushing west, and a new town was being built just 2 days' ride from the ranch. It was the first time they had heard of a path back to civilization, a way out of this endless expanse of dirt and sky. For them, the news wasn't salvation, it was erasure. Everything they had endured, every small routine they had built, dissolved in a few sentences about steel and steam. Outside the barn, the ranchers didn't celebrate either. They just listened. One of them removed his hat and wiped his brow, whispering, "It's over," but the word hung heavy, as if it didn't quite know what to do with itself. For the sisters, it was the first proof that the world beyond the ranch still existed and that it was moving on without them. Fen wrote in her journal that day, they didn't cheer. They just stared at the dirt afterward. Leanne asked Boone quietly, in halting English, "Does this mean we go?" Boone hesitated. He didn't know how to say that progress on paper didn't mean freedom in practice. There were still arrangements to be made, passage to be secured. The isolation might be over for the territory, but for his prisoners, the waiting had just begun. That night, the ranch light stayed on longer than usual. The men talked late into the night, their voices a low hum from the main house. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world was changing. But inside the barn, silence was the only sound that made sense. The ranch gates opened not with fanfare, but with bureaucracy. The isolation was ending, yet the machinery of survival rolled on. A wagon arrived, this one empty, meant for transport. From it stepped the same supply driver, now acting as a makeshift agent of passage. His mission was simple: count, record, and return them to the world. The sisters were lined up outside the barn under the morning sun. The driver made notes on a clipboard. For the first time since their arrival, their names were written down in full. Leanne looked at the rough paper, just a list of names until yesterday, and whispered her own aloud, as if testing whether it still belonged to her. Each woman was given a small bundle of supplies for the journey: a blanket, a small bag of dried meat, a canteen of water. Martha, Boone's wife, added a small bar of soap to each bundle. The gesture was both practical and, in its own way, kind. Boone stood nearby, assigned to oversee the departure. He tried not to watch but couldn't help noticing the strange blend of ritual and relief. Every motion was mechanical, yet beneath it ran something unspoken, gratitude mixed with disbelief. When Mai reached the wagon, she asked in halting English, "You send us home?" The driver looked up, half smiling. "To the railroad. The rest is up to you." That answer lingered like a prophecy. The final stop was a simple transaction. Boone handed the driver a small pouch of coins. "For their passage," he said gruffly. The irony wasn't lost on them. He had paid for their freedom. When it was over, they were herded toward the wagon. The trail to the new town shimmered, metallic and still in the heat. Boone looked at the exhausted women and muttered to no one. They made it. The prairie wind rolled in, carrying both relief and the faint smell of rain on the horizon. It felt like freedom's edge, but not theirs yet. because beyond that dusty horizon waited a world none of them could have imagined. Years passed. The prairie became a memory. The raw frontier towns turned into cities of glass and concrete, and the world moved on, except for her. Fen, one of the sisters from the dusty clearing, lived quietly in a crowded city apartment, her hair streaked with grey, her name still half-whispered in her neighborhood. On a wooden shelf near the window, she kept one strange relic of the past, a small, crudely carved wooden horse. The wood had long since smoothed with age, dulled by decades of air and time, but she never parted with it. Visitors sometimes asked why she kept this simple toy from a time and place of such hardship. She always gave the same answer, because it was the first thing that wasn't hate that day on the ranch. The older ranch hand had silently carved it and left it on the barn steps. That small, wordless gesture had outlasted every uniform, every fear. It wasn't about the toy. It was about the shock of kindness from a hand she'd been taught to fear. Most of the rations and supplies from that time were used and forgotten. But this small horse became a monument to contradiction. Sometimes, when the city throbbed with life, she'd hold the horse gently, her eyes lost somewhere between memory and disbelief. That day, she had learned something that no hardship or survival could teach, that war against circumstance wasn't just fought with endurance, it was survived with gestures. She'd seen the worst of humanity and still found a reason to remember the smallest act of decency. Not because it erased the pain, but because it proved something inside people refused to die. Her diary entry from that time read simply, "Kindness was the only thing we weren't prepared for." Outside her window, the city lights shimmered across the skyline, neon reflections where open prairie once stretched to the horizon. She didn't call herself a survivor, and she never spoke of Boone or the ranch again. But the wooden horse remained, silent and whole. When she died, it was found on that same shelf, still standing. Archivists later placed it in a museum, labeled only, "Personal Item, circa 1880", and under the glass, that small, carved horse stands patiently, even now, proof that mercy, once given, doesn't fade.